Okay, so in this little video, I'm going to go over um, how the first cells actually must have arisen from non-living material. So how do we go from inorganic, non-living to living? Because we know spontaneous generation, right, doesn't occur now, but at some point we had to have gone from the non-living to the living. And so there's four main processes that scientists believe need to have happened to be able to go from non-living to living. So for that spontaneous origin of life. The first process is the non-living synthesis of simple organic molecules. So first we have to make tiny organic molecules. Organic molecules are ones that contain carbon. Some examples are carbohydrates, like sugars. It could be amino acids, proteins, all of these fats, everything that is a molecule containing carbon that is generally associated with living organisms. And so we have to get those to be synthesized first. And those first organic molecules, they think, were very simple monomers that needed to be put together into more complex organic molecules. So going from, say, like little tiny glucose molecules to something more complex, like a carbohydrate, like, cellulose to make a plant cell wall. So we've got to go from those simple organic molecules need to form, and then those need to be linked together into more complex molecules. And then those molecules actually have to be able to replicate themselves to make inheritance possible. And lastly, there needs to be some sort of membrane around them to have an internal environment different from the external. So let's take a look at some of the experiments involved here. First, you have to realize that early Earth, we're talking the first living organisms, it was, 3.5 billion years ago. And early Earth was way different than it is today. It was a very reducing environment. There wasn't really oxygen. It was mostly ammonia and methane and other things that we wouldn't find in the atmosphere in such heavy concentrations today. So it was much more friendly for little molecules to start forming, because today's atmosphere is really oxidizing, and things tend to, get their electrons stolen from them pretty quickly. So one of the first experiments was with Miller and Urey, and they were testing a hypothesis by another set of scientists called Operin and Haldane. And they believed that early Earth's atmosphere was, very reducing, again, water vapor, nitrogen and oxides, carbon dioxide, methane, so ammonia even. And so they were testing to see, okay, could the first organic molecules have formed in this atmosphere? Because it wouldn't have happened spontaneously in the atmosphere we have today. So they set up and they got all of these with some water vapor into a chamber. So they've got all these gases here. And then they hit all those molecules with an electrode, like a, kind of a spark, an electric spark. And sure enough, when the water condensed back down, they collected that water with whatever chemicals were in it, and they found that sure enough there was some very simple organic molecules, mainly amino acids, that had formed during this experiment. So they were the first. Miller and Urey were the first to really show, okay, we can make simple organic molecules out of inorganic molecules. In a way. And even if, some evidence says that the early atmosphere wasn't quite as reducing or oxidizing, but again, when this similar experiment has been done in a number of different ways, we've actually seen that, okay, amino acids and other simple organic molecules can form spontaneously. So then, how do we get those or where did these come from? Because some of the main places where we would think where some of these molecules might come from would be like volcanic, where there's plenty of these cool little microclimates where a reducing atmosphere would allow that to happen. And also deep sea vents would also be an obvious place for that to happen. But it's also actually been hypothesized that these simple organic molecules could have happened instead of by a volcano or a deep sea vent. They could have come actually from outer space. And you'll see, we're going to watch a longer video tomorrow, but if you have all of these molecules like on a meteorite or something, when it passes through the atmosphere, that forms enough energy for some of those to be able to come together. And so we found that actually carbon compounds have been found in some meteorites that have landed on Earth, and that includes amino acids. So there's this idea of extraterrestrial origins. Okay, so now we have our molecules, spontaneous generation of simple organic molecules like amino acids. We know that can happen. So once those are there, it's actually pretty simple to get them to join together to form more complex molecules. And even if you just dripped amino acids on hot sand or rock, that actually gets it to link together to be able to make some more complex proteins. And so we go with these small little simple organic molecules to making more complex polymers simply by adding some heat in the right conditions. Okay. And then once that's done, how could we actually get them to self-replicate? Well, it's pretty widely believed that the very first self-replicating molecules were RNA, because RNA has two characteristics that are very important. RNA is actually a template, like DNA, RNA, you can copy that template with complementary base pairing. So it has the potential to be copied. But then how do you catalyze that reaction? How do you initiate that copying to happen? Well, it turns out that RNA can kind of fold up into a three-dimensional structure that allows it to catalyze its own copying reaction. So these ribozymes, these early RNA molecules, were considered to be possibly the very first self-replicating organic molecules. And then lastly, if any of those cool organic molecules manage to get into a membrane of lipids or something like that. And there's a lot of potential for lipids to come together and form a membrane because of the phospholipids having that hydrophilic, hydrophobic properties to it. So it can often produce these cool little mycel bubbles. And so if some of that RNA got in there, then the internal environment inside that membrane could then be different from the outside world. And if they were able to replicate and then that's kind of initiating these very first cells that were sometimes labeled protobionts. Okay, hopefully this is helpful. The 4 steps that I would pay attention to in how do we go from non-living to living are these 4. Okay, and if you can kind of talk about some of the evidence or some of the ways that that's possible to happen. So for this would be like the Miller-Urey, and then also where it could have happened, deep sea vents, maybe from outer space, and then the relatively easy to get from monomer to polymer with just a little bit of heat in the right environment. The self-replicating molecules being RNA because they can be copied and they can actually catalyze the copying. And then lastly, getting them into some sort of membrane to allow them to have an internal chemistry that's a little bit different. All right.